The Apache woman slept in my barn. By morning, she was in my bed. John Miller's life had always been simple. He lived alone on his small ranch on the edge of the Arizona Territory, where the desert met the mountains. The land was harsh and unforgiving, but it was home. He had inherited it from his father, who had taught him how to ride horses, mend fences, and tend to cattle from a young age. Over the years, John had grown used to the rhythm of his days, waking before sunrise, checking on the cattle, repairing fences, and doing whatever was needed to keep the ranch running. Life could be lonely at times, but he liked the quiet. Out here, there were no neighbors for miles, and the only sounds were the wind rustling through the sagebrush, the distant call of a hawk, or the lowing of his cows. That evening, the sky was painted with shades of orange and purple as the sun dipped behind the distant hills. John had spent the entire day mending a broken fence along the northern pasture. His arms ached from hauling posts and stretching wire, and his boots were caked with dust from the dry ground. He wiped his brow with the back of his sleeve and looked over the land. Everything seemed peaceful. The cattle were grazing quietly. The wind whispered through the trees, and the barn, sturdy and well-worn, stood at the edge of the property like a silent guardian. After finishing his chores, John decided to check the barn before nightfall. He had always made it a point to inspect it each evening. Inside, the smell of hay and leather filled the air. The barn was large enough to shelter the horses and store feed and tools, but it also had a small loft where John sometimes slept when he needed to watch over the cattle during storms. He ran his hand along the wooden beams, feeling the rough grain under his fingers. Everything seemed as it always did, until he noticed something strange on the floor. There were footprints in the dust, small, delicate prints, unlike any he had seen before. They led from the edge of the barn, near the old corral gate, to the stall in the back. John frowned. He had seen tracks before, cattle, horses, coyotes, but these were different. They were human. He stepped closer, examining them carefully. They were recent, probably made just an hour or two ago. His heart began to beat a little faster. Out here, intruders were rare, but they were never impossible. Bandits, wandering travelers, or even desperate people passing through could leave such marks. He reached for the lantern he kept by the barn door and lifted it high. The flickering light cast long shadows across the walls and the hay bales. The barn seemed bigger than usual in the dim glow, every corner suddenly mysterious. John called out softly, "Hello? Is someone there?" His voice echoed, but only the wind answered him. He listened closely, his ears straining for any sound. Then, from the farthest stall, he heard a soft rustling. Cautiously, John approached. The lantern light fell on a figure huddled in the hay. At first, he thought it might be a lost child or a wandering traveler seeking shelter, but as he stepped closer, he saw that it was a young woman. He was curled up tightly, wrapped in what little clothing she had, her hair falling in dark strands across her face. Her shoulders shook slightly, as if from cold or fear. John froze for a moment. This was unexpected. He had lived on this ranch for over 20 years and had never encountered anyone like this. The woman stirred slightly, lifting her head and looking at him with wide, cautious eyes. John could see the exhaustion in her face, the dirt and dust on her skin, and the small cuts on her hands. It was clear she had been traveling for a long time and had faced difficulties along the way. She did not speak, only watched him silently. John's first instinct was to step back, unsure of what to do. But then he remembered the lessons his father had taught him about kindness and humanity. Out here, people were often in trouble, and help could mean the difference between life and death. "Are you hurt?" he asked gently, keeping his voice calm and steady. The woman did not answer. She only shook her head slightly and pulled her knees closer. John noticed that her clothing was torn and worn, clearly not made for the harsh conditions of the desert. The night air was already growing colder, and he knew she could not survive long without proper shelter and warmth. Without another thought, John went to the corner of the barn and grabbed an old blanket he had kept for emergencies. He approached slowly, holding it out to her. "Here, take this," he said softly. The woman hesitated, then, after a moment, reached out and accepted the blanket. She wrapped it around herself, shivering, but her eyes never left his. There was a quiet intensity in her gaze, a mixture of fear, relief, and caution. John could sense that she had seen hardships that most people could not imagine. He decided to make her as comfortable as possible for the night. He led her to a small area in the hay, away from the animals and the tools. He placed some food and water nearby, enough for the night, and spoke reassuringly. "You're safe here. No one will hurt you." The woman nodded slightly, still too wary to speak. John respected her silence. He had learned over the years that trust could not be forced. It had to be earned. As he prepared to leave, he noticed the wind picking up outside. Dark clouds were rolling in, and he could hear the faint rumble of distant thunder. A storm was coming, and it would be dangerous for anyone to be out in it, especially someone already exhausted and alone. John made a decision. He would stay in the barn for the night. He could sleep lightly in the loft, keeping watch over her, making sure she was safe until morning. That night, as the storm moved closer, John sat quietly on a bale of hay, listening to the rain begin to patter against the roof and the wind shake the barn doors. The woman remained curled up on the floor, her breathing slow and steady now, as if she had finally allowed herself to rest. John thought about how strange life could be. One moment the ranch was empty and quiet, and the next, it was filled with a presence that changed everything. He did not know who she was, why she had come, or what the next day would bring. But for now, he knew that he could offer her safety, warmth, and a small measure of kindness. As the night wore on, John found himself reflecting on his own life. He had always thought of himself as self-reliant, content with solitude. But now, sitting there in the dim lantern light, he realized that human connections, even fleeting ones, were what made life meaningful. He did not know the woman's story yet, but he was determined to help her in whatever way he could. And so, as the storm raged outside and the barn became a shelter from the wild desert night, John Miller and the unknown woman began an unexpected chapter in both of their lives, one that would test courage, empathy, and the quiet strength that comes from caring for another human being. Neither of them knew what the morning would bring, but in that moment, a fragile trust had been formed, enough to carry them through the darkness and whatever challenges lay ahead. The next morning, John woke before sunrise, as he usually did. The storm had passed during the night, leaving a cool, damp breeze drifting through the barn. The sky was painted in soft shades of pink and gold, and the world outside looked calm and fresh after the rain. He rubbed his eyes, stretched, and quietly climbed down from the loft. The woman was still asleep on the hay, wrapped tightly in the blanket he had given her. Her breathing was steady, but she seemed even more exhausted than the night before. John hesitated for a moment. He did not want to startle her, but he also knew he needed to check on her well-being. He knelt beside her and gently shook her shoulder. "Hey, it's morning," he said softly. She stirred, blinking her dark eyes, and sat up slowly. She looked around, disoriented at first. then focused on John. There was a mixture of caution and curiosity in her expression. She did not speak, but her eyes seemed to ask a question. Who is this man? Can I trust him? John smiled gently and nodded. It's just me. You're safe here. I won't hurt you. The woman relaxed a little, but she still stayed wrapped in the blanket. John decided to give her some food. He brought out a small loaf of bread and a jar of dried meat he had saved for emergencies. Eat, he said. You must be hungry after traveling last night. The woman took the bread hesitantly at first, examining it as if it might be a trick. Then, slowly, she broke off a piece and began to eat. She chewed carefully, savoring each bite. John watched her, realizing how much fear and uncertainty must have guided her journey. Out here in the desert, survival depended on more than strength. It depended on trust and judgment. After she had eaten, John tried again to speak gently. Do you have a name? The woman paused, then spoke a single word. Softly, Nayeli. It was unfamiliar to John, but he nodded, committing the name to memory. Nayeli, he repeated. That's a beautiful name. I'm John. She nodded once, her eyes cautious but steady. There was still a distance between them, an invisible wall of mistrust, but it was smaller than before. The morning passed slowly. John worked in the barn, repairing a broken stall door, while Nayeli sat quietly on the hay, watching him. Every so often she would glance outside, her expression distant, as if remembering something from the road she had traveled. John tried to be patient. He knew she had been through a lot, and rushing her would only frighten her. Out here, patience was as important as water or food. By mid-morning, the sun was higher, warming the barn and drying the damp spots from the storm. John decided it was time to show Nayeli the rest of the ranch. Come with me, he said gently. At first, she hesitated, gripping the blanket tightly around her shoulders. But then curiosity seemed to win over fear. Slowly, she followed him outside, her bare feet brushing against the wet grass and dirt. The world outside the barn was vast and beautiful. Rolling pastures stretched for miles, dotted with sagebrush and wildflowers, still glistening from the rain. Cattle grazed peacefully, and a few horses wandered nearby, their coats damp from the morning mist. Nayeli stopped at the edge of the corral, taking in the sights and smells. She reached out to touch the coat of a nearby horse, and it nickered softly. Her eyes lit up with wonder and a hint of joy, a glimpse of her spirit that had survived despite her hardships. John smiled quietly. They're gentle, he said, but they'll sense fear. Be calm, and they'll be calm too. Nayeli nodded, still watching the animals with quiet fascination. John realized that she had likely lived most of her life away from places like this. Her world had been one of travel, survival, and uncertainty. Here on his ranch, she could see another side of life, a life that was quiet, safe, and steady. As the day went on, John and Nayeli began to communicate more, even without many words. He used gestures and simple phrases, pointing to objects and actions, while she responded with nods, shakes of the head, or small words in her own language. Slowly, a bridge of understanding began to form between them. John realized that trust was not built in a single night. It was built over small moments, shared experiences, and simple acts of kindness. By late afternoon, John suggested they fetch water from the well. Nayeli had never seen the pump system he used, and she watched curiously as he drew up a bucket of fresh water. He handed it to her, showing her how to drink and refill the bucket. She imitated him carefully, and for a moment they shared a small laugh, a sound that felt light and rare in the vast, quiet desert. That laughter seemed to break some of the tension, and John felt a warmth in his chest he had not felt in years. As the sun began to dip behind the hills, John realized it was time to think about supper. He started a small fire outside the barn, preparing a simple meal of beans and cornbread. Nayeli helped by gathering kindling and arranging stones around the fire, her movements careful but deliberate. She still spoke little, but her presence had become comfortable, almost natural. The air was filled with the smell of cooking food and the soft crackle of flames, and for the first time since her arrival, Nayeli seemed to relax completely. While they ate, John tried to learn more about her story. "Where are you from?" he asked. Nayeli paused, looking at the distant mountains. Then she spoke slowly, describing a village far to the east, a place she had left after a raid. She did not go into detail, but John understood enough to see that her journey had been dangerous. She had traveled alone for days, facing hunger, fear, and uncertainty. Yet here she was, still standing, still alive, and still trusting enough to accept help. The evening grew cooler, and the stars began to appear in the sky, bright and clear over the desert. John and Nayeli sat by the fire for a while, watching the night unfold. The barn behind them was quiet. The animals settled for the evening. It was a peaceful moment, a contrast to the storm of events that had brought them together. John thought about the strange twists of life, how a single night could change everything, how unexpected encounters could leave a lasting mark. Finally, John suggested that Nayeli rest again for the night. He helped her arrange the blanket in the hay and made sure she was comfortable. She looked at him and nodded, a small gesture of trust that spoke volumes. John climbed into the loft once more, keeping a watchful eye. He could hear the wind rustling outside and the occasional call of an owl, but the barn felt safe. For now, they were both protected from the world outside, bound together by circumstance and quiet understanding. As he drifted into a light sleep, John could not help but wonder what the next day would bring. Nayeli's presence had already changed the rhythm of his life. The solitude he had once cherished now felt different, full of potential and questions. Who was she really? What dangers had she faced? And how much longer would she stay? But for the moment, those questions could wait. Tonight, they were safe. Tonight, a connection had begun, delicate but real, between a man who had lived alone for years and a young woman who had traveled far to find shelter. And so, as the desert night stretched on, filled with the whisper of the wind and the soft breathing of two people brought together by fate, a new chapter quietly began. A chapter of trust, survival, and the slow, careful unfolding of human connection. The next morning arrived quietly. The sun rose slowly over the horizon, painting the desert in soft gold and pink hues. John stirred in the loft of the barn, stretching his stiff muscles from the night spent lightly sleeping while keeping watch. His eyes immediately sought Nayeli. She was awake, sitting on the hay, quietly observing the animals in the corral. Her dark hair fell over her shoulders, damp from the morning dew, and her eyes reflected a mixture of curiosity and caution. John descended the ladder and approached slowly. "Good morning," he said softly. Nayeli looked up at him and nodded, a small smile forming on her lips. It was subtle, almost shy, but it carried warmth. It was a sign that their trust, fragile as it was, had grown a little stronger overnight. John felt a quiet relief. Moments like these were rare, especially with someone who had traveled alone through dangers he could only imagine. They began the morning with simple chores. John showed Nayeli how to feed the horses and gather water for the cattle. She watched intently, then tried her hand at the tasks, her movements careful but precise. It was clear she had never lived on a ranch, yet she learned quickly, her determination evident in the way she handled the animals with gentle care. The animals, sensing her cautious but respectful approach, responded to her as if they understood she meant no harm. John couldn't help but admire her quiet strength. As they worked together, John noticed her glancing frequently toward the hills in the distance, as if her thoughts were far away, somewhere beyond the ranch. "Are you thinking about your journey?" he asked cautiously, unsure if she would respond. Nayeli paused, then nodded. Her eyes grew distant, and for a moment John sensed a sadness that seemed heavy and ancient. He realized that she had carried more than just the exhaustion of travel. She had carried memories, fear, and perhaps loss. By midday, the sun was high and hot. John suggested a break. They sat under the shade of an old mesquite tree, sharing some bread and dried meat. Nayeli ate slowly, savoring each bite, while John watched her thoughtfully. He had always believed in the value of helping others, but now he saw how fragile trust could be. One wrong word or gesture could send her running into the desert, and he could not allow that. He needed her to feel safe, and that meant patience, understanding, and respect. After a few moments of quiet, Nayeli finally spoke a few words in her own language. John listened carefully, then tried to respond, using gestures and simple phrases. Though their words were limited, their understanding grew through observation and small actions. Nayeli pointed toward the hills, then to herself, and made a soft sound. John guessed that she was talking about where she had come from, her eyes reflecting memories she could not forget. He nodded gently, showing he understood without pressing for details. The afternoon passed slowly, with small tasks and quiet conversation. John taught Nayeli how to mend a small fence that had been damaged by the storm. She watched intently as he worked, then tried herself. Her hands were skilled, despite the rough skin and calluses from her travels. She struggled at first, but John encouraged her patiently. By the time the fence was repaired, she had completed half of the work, and a sense of pride lit up her face. It was a small victory, but for both of them, it felt significant. As the day began to cool, John suggested they take a walk to the nearby stream. The path was narrow and rocky, but Nayeli followed, her steps sure and careful. The sound of flowing water grew louder as they approached, and she paused at the edge of the stream, kneeling to touch the water with her hands. The water was cool and clear, reflecting the sky above. She cupped it in her hands and drank, her eyes closing briefly as if tasting relief itself. John watched silently, understanding that for her, this was more than just water. It was a moment of peace after hardship. They sat by the stream for a while, listening to the gentle flow of water and the rustling of leaves in the breeze. John noticed that Nayeli seemed more relaxed than she had in the morning. She even attempted a few words in English, pointing to objects and repeating his words, her pronunciation careful but determined. John encouraged her, smiling. Every small word she learned was a bridge to communication, a step toward understanding each other in a world where words often failed. As they walked back to the barn, John noticed shadows stretching across the desert floor. The sun was lower now, casting long golden rays over the landscape. He felt a growing sense of responsibility. Nayeli had come into his life suddenly, unexpectedly, and now he could not ignore her presence. She was alone, vulnerable, and far from the people she had known. He promised himself silently that he would help her in any way he could, no matter how challenging it might become. Back at the barn, John prepared a small fire to cook their evening meal. Nayeli assisted quietly, arranging stones around the fire and gathering dry wood. Her hands moved with careful precision, and for the first time she seemed comfortable in her surroundings. She even offered a small smile when a spark from the fire caught her attention, a simple moment of joy that warmed John's heart. He realized that despite her hardships, she had not lost her ability to find beauty in small things. As night fell, the sky filled with stars bright and clear over the desert. The barn and the surrounding land were bathed in soft silver light, and the fire crackled warmly between them. John and Nayeli ate in silence for a while, the comfort of routine and companionship filling the space between them. For John, it was a rare feeling, this quiet connection with another human being. Fragile but real, built from trust and shared experience. After supper, John suggested that Nayeli rest again. She nodded, gathering the blanket she had grown accustomed to. John helped her settle into the hay, making sure she was warm and comfortable. As she lay down, she looked at him with a mixture of gratitude and curiosity. John climbed into the loft once more, keeping watch as he had the previous night. The barn was quiet except for the occasional stir of an animal or the whisper of the wind. But that night, John noticed something different. Nayeli had moved closer to the center of the haystack, her movements subtle but deliberate. She seemed less fearful, more trusting. John realized that in the short time she had been there, she had begun to rely on him not just for safety, but for comfort. It was a small but important change, a sign that the bond between them was growing stronger. As he watched her, John thought about the unpredictability of life. One moment the ranch was quiet and empty, the next it was filled with the presence of someone who had endured hardships he could barely imagine. He reflected on the power of human connection and the responsibility that came with it. Nayeli had placed her trust in him, even if only a little, and he could not take that lightly. The night stretched on, filled with the sounds of the desert and the soft breathing of two people brought together by chance. John remained vigilant, aware that anything could happen in this rugged, unpredictable land. Yet he also felt a sense of hope, a feeling that despite danger, fear, and uncertainty, moments of trust and kindness could exist, even in the harshest places. By the time he drifted into a light sleep, John knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges. Nayeli's presence had changed the rhythm of his life, and he was beginning to understand that life could be richer, fuller, and more meaningful when shared with another human being. He did not know what the future held, but he was determined to help her face it, no matter the obstacles. And so, in the quiet barn under a vast starlit sky, John and Nayeli's story continued. A story of trust slowly building, of courage emerging from vulnerability, and of two people learning to navigate a world that was both beautiful and unforgiving. The following morning, John woke to a strange stillness. The usual sounds of the desert, the rustle of leaves, the distant calls of birds, the low murmur of cattle, were quieter than usual. Something felt different in the air, though he could not name it. He rubbed his eyes and climbed down from the loft, lantern in hand. Nayeli was awake, sitting on the hay as before, but there was tension in her shoulders and a shadow in her eyes. She did not smile or speak. Instead, she stared toward the distant hills where the sunlight glinted off the rocks. John's heart sank. He had grown accustomed to her quiet presence, the subtle trust that had begun to develop between them. But now, it seemed that something from her past had resurfaced, something that reminded her of the dangers she had fled. He approached slowly, speaking softly. "Nayeli, what is it? Are you all right?" She flinched slightly at his voice but did not answer. Her eyes were fixed somewhere far away, and for the first time John sensed real fear in her. As the morning passed, it became clear that Nayeli was restless. She moved about the barn, tidying things, stacking hay, and organizing the small space, but her movements were hurried, almost frantic. John tried to calm her, offering water and food, suggesting they rest, but she shook her head and refused. "Nayeli," he said gently, "you've traveled far. You need to rest. You're safe here." She looked at him, her eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and worry, then nodded slightly, but she could not settle. By late morning, John noticed that she kept glancing at the horizon, her gaze darting to the distant ridges as if expecting someone or something to appear. He realized that she had likely encountered dangers on the road, perhaps people who had tried to harm her, and the memory of that fear still lingered. He could see the tension in her hands, the way her body stiffened at every sound. She was carrying a heavy burden, one that he could not fully understand, but he knew he had to help her carry it. John decided to take her outside for a walk, hoping that movement and the fresh air might ease her anxiety. He led her across the pasture, pointing to the cattle and explaining small tasks he performed daily. Nayeli listened quietly, but her eyes kept wandering, always returning to the hills and the distance. John could tell that the simple distractions were not enough. Something deeper troubled her, a memory or fear that refused to fade. As they walked, Nayeli suddenly stopped, her eyes widening in alarm. John followed her gaze and saw a group of riders far off in the distance, their figures small but unmistakably human. They were moving toward the ranch, and John could sense the urgency in their pace. Nayeli stiffened, fear gripping her once again. John realized immediately that these riders could pose a threat not just to her, but to both of them. He needed to act fast. "Stay behind me," he whispered, placing himself slightly in front of her. Nayeli nodded, her body trembling, but she trusted him enough to follow his lead. John's mind raced. He had lived in the desert for years and knew how to defend his land. But this situation was different. These people could be dangerous, and he had no idea what they wanted. All he knew was that Nayeli's safety was his responsibility. The riders drew closer, and John could see that they were young men, probably travelers or scouts. Their expressions were hard to read from a distance, but the way they moved suggested purpose. John led Nayeli toward the barn, keeping to the shadows, hoping to stay unnoticed. He whispered instructions, telling her to stay quiet and move carefully. Nayeli obeyed, her eyes wide with fear but trusting him completely. Once inside the barn, John quickly secured the doors and windows, using old wooden beams to reinforce them. Nayeli crouched behind a stack of hay, her breathing shallow, her hands gripping the blanket tightly. John felt a surge of protectiveness. He had never imagined himself in this position, not as a protector, not as someone responsible for another person's life, but he knew he could not fail. Nayeli had trusted him, and he would honor that trust. The riders reached the edge of the property, slowing their horses as they searched for signs of movement. John could hear their voices now, calling out to each other in low tones. He motioned for Nayeli to stay quiet. She obeyed, pressing herself closer to the hay, her fear palpable. John's heart pounded, but he remained calm. He had faced storms, wild animals, and harsh winters alone, but this was different. This was a test of his courage, his judgment, and his ability to protect someone who relied on him. Minutes felt like hours as they waited. The riders moved closer, scanning the barn from the outside. One of them dismounted, approaching the structure cautiously. John could hear the soft crunch of boots on dirt. He knew he had to make a choice: confront them or find a way to hide Nayeli and wait them out. He whispered to her, "Stay calm. Don't move. Nayeli nodded, her eyes wide but trusting him. The rider reached the barn and began tapping the door with the tip of his boot, testing its strength. John held his breath, gripping the wooden beam tightly. He could see Nayeli trembling behind the hay. Suddenly, the rider called out, "Is anyone in there?" His voice was firm but not angry. John considered his options. He could try to speak, explain that the barn was empty, or wait for them to leave. Before he could decide, Nayeli made a small sound, a soft gasp of fear. The rider froze, listening. John knew they had been discovered, at least partially. He stepped forward slowly, raising his hands to show he meant no harm. "We're not here to cause trouble," he said calmly, his voice steady. "This is private property." "Please leave." The rider hesitated, glancing at his companions. After a tense moment, he nodded and called for them to move on. The group slowly retreated, disappearing into the distance. John exhaled deeply, his body shaking from the tension. Nayeli looked at him with wide eyes, relief flooding her face. She had been terrified, and John realized how close they had come to disaster. That night, after the riders were gone, John helped Nayeli settle into the hay again. She was exhausted, her body trembling from the day's events. He wrapped the blanket around her tightly, offering comfort in the quiet of the barn. She leaned against him slightly, a gesture of trust that moved John deeply. For the first time, he felt the weight of responsibility, not as a burden, but as a bond. As he climbed into the loft to watch over her, John reflected on the day. The fear they had faced together had tested them both, but it had also strengthened the connection between them. Nayeli had survived her past alone, but now she had someone to rely on, someone who would fight to keep her safe. And John, who had lived most of his life in solitude, had discovered a new sense of purpose and courage he had not known he possessed. The desert night stretched on, quiet and still, except for the occasional distant howl of a coyote. John kept a careful watch, listening for any sign of danger, but also allowing himself to rest. Nayeli slept lightly, her breathing steady but cautious. They had survived the day, but John knew the challenges were not over. The world outside was unpredictable, and she had enemies he could not see. Yet he also knew that their shared courage, trust, and determination would carry them through whatever came next. By the time dawn approached, John realized that something had changed. Nayeli was no longer just a weary traveler seeking shelter. She was a companion, someone whose presence had become essential. The day's events had tested them both, but they had emerged stronger, more connected, and more determined to face the challenges ahead together. And though the future remained uncertain, John felt a quiet confidence that they would meet it, side by side, whatever it might bring. The morning sun rose slowly over the desert, casting long shadows across the ranch. John awoke with a sense of quiet anticipation. Last night had been difficult. The danger they had faced with the riders had left a lingering tension, but the barn was finally peaceful. He climbed down from the loft to find Nayeli awake, sitting on the hay and watching the first rays of light touch the land. She looked calm now, but her eyes carried the quiet wisdom of someone who had survived hardship and danger before. John offered her a small smile. "Good morning," he said softly. Nayeli nodded in return, a subtle gesture that had become their way of communicating over the past days. Words were not always necessary. Their trust had grown through shared experiences, simple gestures, and acts of care. John realized that in this brief time a bond had formed between them, a bond stronger than either of them had expected. Breakfast was simple. John had brought out bread and some dried meat, and they ate quietly together. Nayeli seemed more relaxed than she had in the past few days, even offering a small smile when John handed her the food. The fear and tension that had gripped her during the previous day were fading. John could see the beginnings of hope in her eyes, a sense that perhaps, for the first time in a long while, she was truly safe. After breakfast, John suggested they spend the morning tending to the ranch. There were fences to repair and water to carry, and he wanted Nayeli to see that life could have moments of routine and calm, even after chaos. She followed him willingly, her movements careful but confident. As they worked together, she asked questions about the ranch, the cattle, and the horses, pointing and repeating words she had learned. John answered patiently, teaching her not only how things worked, but also why they mattered. By midday, the sun was high and the desert air grew warm. John led Nayeli to the small stream near the ranch, a place where they had gone before, to gather water and enjoy a brief respite from chores. The water sparkled in the sunlight, and Nayeli knelt to touch it, cupping her hands and drinking deeply. She smiled faintly at John, and for a moment, the weight of the past days seemed to lift. The stream, the animals, the soft breeze, everything around them felt peaceful, almost magical in its simplicity. As they returned to the barn, John noticed that Nayeli carried herself differently now. The fear and hesitation that had marked her arrival were gone. She walked with quiet confidence, helping him lift hay bales and move tools. John realized that in just a few days, she had begun to reclaim a sense of strength and independence that circumstances had once forced her to hide. He felt a deep sense of satisfaction and relief. She was no longer simply a traveler seeking refuge. She was someone who could face the world again, with courage and trust. That afternoon, John decided to show Nayeli more of the surrounding land. They walked together along the edges of the ranch, exploring the hills and valleys that stretched into the distance. The desert was alive with color, the greens of the sagebrush, the yellows and purples of wildflowers, and the deep blues of distant mountains. Nayeli paused often, touching the plants, listening to the wind, and watching the animals below. John spoke little, letting her take in the world around her. He understood that after all she had endured, moments like this, quiet, simple, beautiful, were what she needed most. As evening approached, John prepared a small fire outside the barn. They sat together sharing a simple meal and watched the sun sink below the horizon. The sky was ablaze with color, gold, pink, and deep purple blending into each other. Nayeli reached out to touch the firelight, smiling softly at the warmth it offered. John realized that in this quiet moment, the hardships of the past days felt distant. For now, they were safe, together, and alive. Later, as night fell, John helped Nayeli settle into the hay for the last time. She looked at him with gratitude and something deeper, an unspoken understanding that he had protected her, cared for her, and shared something meaningful. John climbed into the loft one final time, watching over her as she slept. The barn was quiet except for the gentle rustling of hay and the occasional whisper of the wind outside. He thought about the journey she had endured, and the unexpected arrival that had changed both of their lives. Over the next few days, Nayeli stayed on the ranch, helping with chores, learning more English words, and growing stronger with each passing day. John taught her how to mend fences, tend to animals, and manage the land. Each lesson was more than just practical. It was a lesson in trust, patience, and cooperation. In return, Nayeli shared stories of her past, carefully, in bits and pieces. She spoke of her village, her family, and the hardships that had forced her to leave. John listened without judgment, offering support and understanding. Through these shared moments, A bond deepened between them. Nayeli had come to the ranch seeking shelter, but what she found was friendship, trust, and a sense of belonging. John, who had spent so many years alone, discovered a connection he had never known he needed. A relationship built not on obligation, but on mutual care and respect. Together they navigated the quiet rhythm of the ranch, finding comfort in the simple routines of life. One morning, after a week had passed, Nayeli approached John with a look of determination. She had decided it was time to continue her journey. Though she had found safety on the ranch, she knew that her life would eventually call her back to the road, to her people, and to her own destiny. John felt a pang of sadness, but also understood. He had come to care deeply for her, but he also knew that part of caring was allowing her the freedom to choose her own path. Before she left, John prepared a small bundle of supplies for her journey: bread, dried meat, and a flask of water. He handed it to her quietly. "Take this," he said gently. "It will help you along the way." Nayeli took it with a nod, her eyes glistening with gratitude. She did not speak much, but the gesture of trust and connection between them said more than words ever could. As Nayeli mounted a horse that John had helped prepare for her, she turned to him one last time. John felt a mixture of pride and melancholy. He had helped her survive, heal, and regain her strength, but now he would have to let her go. She gave him a small, shy smile, a silent promise that she would remember the kindness he had shown her. And with that, she rode off toward the distant hills, disappearing into the horizon, with the sun at her back. John watched until she was gone, standing quietly in the barn as the wind rustled through the desert. The ranch was empty once more, but it was different now. The days had been brighter, the work had felt fuller, and his life had been touched by something unexpected and profound. He realized that in helping Nayeli, he had also discovered something within himself, a capacity for trust, courage, and compassion that he had never fully acknowledged. The barn, once a quiet and empty shelter, now held memories of her presence: the laughter, the shared tasks, the fear, and the trust. John understood that life was unpredictable, and sometimes the people who crossed our paths do so for reasons we cannot fully explain. Nayeli had come into his life for a brief moment, but the impact of her visit would remain forever. As evening fell and the stars began to shine over the desert, John walked outside, taking in the quiet beauty of the land. He thought about the journey they had shared, the trust they had built, and the courage it had taken to face danger together. Though Nayeli was gone, the lessons, memories, and connection remained, shaping his life in ways he would carry forward forever. And so life on the ranch returned to its quiet rhythm, but it was no longer the same. The wind still whispered through the sagebrush, the cattle still grazed peacefully, and the barn still stood strong. But now it held the echoes of a story that would never be forgotten, a story of fear and courage, of trust and kindness, and of two lives briefly intertwined in a way that left a permanent mark on both. John sat on the edge of the porch that night, looking at the stars and smiling softly. He knew that even though Nayeli had gone, their paths had crossed for a reason, and that reason had changed him. The desert, vast and unforgiving, was no longer just a place of solitude. It was a place where courage, kindness, and human connection could thrive even in the harshest of circumstances. And with that thought, he turned back toward the barn, ready to continue his life, carrying with him the lessons of the past days, the memory of a brave young woman, and the knowledge that even in a lonely world, trust and kindness could create something extraordinary.